It depends kind of where you are in Canada. I'm really excited to have a panel today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves as they go, but I'll just introduce their names quickly. We have first up Julie Haskill. Sorry for saying your name wrong in the emails. That is totally my bad. And then we have Grace Swain, and then we have Melissa Engdahl. So yeah, I'll just hand it over to you guys and let you guys get going.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having us. Okay, so I'm Julie Haskell, sometimes known as Jill slash Lisa. Go by a few names in my circles, and I'm here with my colleagues Grace Swain and Melissa Engdahl. Today we're going to be talking about how values shape effective public communication and engagement through three diverse lenses: municipal government, Indigenous engagement, and social work. I'm a certified communications professional or CMP. I spent 18 years in municipal government communications, and I'm now working at Axiom Group with Melissa in marketing and communications. And what I'm going to be covering is the role of values in public engagement, strategies for reaching and engaging diverse audiences, and some real world municipal examples, as well as the use of feedback loops to build trust and accountability. So, why values matter in public communication? It's quite simple. Values drive the effectiveness of any public communication. It's not just about delivering information, it's about engaging people and creating two-way dialogue. Same with public engagement. It's not just about informing the public, it's about creating dialogue and trust. When values like transparency, inclusivity, and meaningful participation guide communication efforts, community staff and clients feel heard and respected. Without values-driven communication, engagement feels performative, leading to distrust, disengagement, and poor decision making. The International Association for Public Participation, or IAP2, is a global organization that promotes best practices in public engagement. It emphasizes transparency, inclusivity, and meaningful participation. Sorry. The framework is a valuable tool to communicate effectively by ensuring stakeholders are not just informed, but actively engaged in decision making. And I find that I use this tool across any engagement effort. I do have a look through to see, to make sure that I'm meeting those principles of transparency, inclusivity, and meaningful participation. Transparency meaning that people need to understand the process, decisions, and next steps. Trust erodes when the public feels information is hidden or filtered. And an example of that might be publishing meeting minutes, creating clear project timelines, or sharing decision rationales. The inclusivity pillar, public participation should reflect the full diversity of the community. You actively seek out underrepresented voices. So don't just relying on the usual participants or even the usual methods of communicating. And some examples of that might be engaging non-English speakers, seniors, Indigenous communities, and youth in decision-making or communications activities, or considering these underrepresented groups in your communication activities. And then meaningful participation. So make it mean something. If people are going to take the time to engage, their input should have the potential to influence the outcome. So communicating how their feedback is used or being considered, or how your messages will be consumed by the end user is important. Otherwise, it's just an empty exercise. So, for example, in municipal government, creating a transportation plan might have some resident feedback to look at the proposed routes and how they might better serve the communities. With staff, it could be this model could be applied when working with different groups, like an internal committee. in creating those expectations on what the dialogue looks like. And in business, it could look like customer feedback that might help develop or improve or change a product or service offering. So I've just got the spectrum of engagement or public participation up. And it just outlines the different levels of engagement. And like I said, I look at this whenever I'm communicating with the public and not just when creating an engagement plan, because it really does help you understand what your goal is and what level you want that two-way dialogue to fit in. So in some cases, you may be just informing. And then there's some different tools that you can use for disseminating information. Potentially, you're looking to consult with different groups within an organization or externally. And then the increasing level of participation goes from the left to the right. So all the way to empowering people to be very hands-on and participatory in the whatever needs to be communicated or wherever you're looking for engagement. So you'll be getting a copy of this after, so you can refer back to this, as well as some information in the resources as well, on how to read up on this. So, another piece that I find is a really important aspect of communicating is meeting people where they're at. And this applies not just to public engagement, but also any communication that you're at. Don't expect people to come to you. Not everybody follows a government or company website. Not everybody watches a council meeting or reads press releases. So if engagement or communication is only happening in select or formal spaces, you're missing some really key voices and key opportunities there. So what this looks like and how you might apply it is going to community spaces. So libraries, local businesses, farmers markets, cultural centers, staff rooms, actually going to where the people are. Um, Leverage your trusted messengers or ambassadors. So those are community leaders, grassroots organizations, faith groups, or people who just have influence in your organization that people look to for information, and that might not always be a senior leader. So really finding those advocates and utilizing them to help get your messaging across. It's important to use accessible and familiar communication channels such as social media, in-person meetings, online forums. People might be looking to engage or read or learn more at 2 a.m. So making it really accessible for people to find and consume that information is important. And to give you some examples of what this might look like. So in a municipal environment, setting up a pop-up info booth at a transit station to ask about the routes is a great idea because you're going to where people are, you're going to where they're actually using that service, and you're meeting people where they're at. You're not expecting them to come to you for information, and remembering to use a variety of media to reach your audience because every individual prefers or sees information in different ways. So an example of this might be putting staff communication on your intranet, sharing it in team meetings, and providing a paper copy in the lunchroom on your staff news board or something like that. So that you're ensuring that there's different ways people might consume that information instead of sticking to one or, a very traditional method. So some other real world municipal examples is remembering that these principles aren't just for government, they apply to business communications as well. So whether you're engaging the public on policy decisions or working with customers, employees, stakeholders in a corporate setting, those values-driven engagement methods really foster trust, loyalty, and long-term relationships. So Before launching any engagement initiative, the stakeholder identification or audience analysis is so important. Really identifying who's affected and who needs to be at the table. So, knowing your audience, as we all know, as we all heard, is so important, and it works across engagement, internal communications, external communications, really identifying who you're talking to and where they're at and how they want to consume this information is so important. Um, Another piece is the audience-centered messaging. So, being effective in communication means using very clear, tailored messaging that meets the audience's needs. So, as an example, in government policy documents, um, could be have very simplified public summaries. A sustainability report through a business might need to be communicated differently to investors versus consumers, or also potentially having two versions of something where something is translated into another language if that is, what you deem to be really effective for your audience. And then finally, inclusive decision making. So, when we're talking about engagement specifically, it's not just about asking for input, it's about making people feel like they're really truly part of that process. So, again, go using the transit example, basing that on feedback that you've been given and being able to show how you've used that feedback is really important. Similarly, a business might adjust its product features or services based on customer insights or reviews. They might adjust those things. So be prepared to be vulnerable and open yourself up for feedback. And when I say this decision making, it just doesn't apply to where decisions need to be made. It's about creating two-way dialogue or a feedback loop wherever you have the opportunity to do that. So that leads me to how much power feedback loops have. So it's important because people disengage when they feel their input or their voices aren't heard. So if they feel like they're not valued, if they feel like what they're saying doesn't matter, they're just going to stop doing it. That, everybody has a limited amount of energy. So, really important to show that value through those clear feedback loops, and how their opinions have contributed to your decision making. So, how to apply this? In the industry, we tend to call it a what we heard report, although it does have a few different names. But applying it by saying, "Here's what we've heard, here's what we've changed, and here's why," being very clear on that, and it can definitely be something that's used in engagement. But look at how you might apply that to communication in general, and especially when you're working with clients or internal staff. Look at where you can give people the opportunity to have that two-way dialogue. Um, Making those reports or communications readily available by summarizing the key themes and showing real world examples of what that impact has is also really useful. And as an example, if you're in government and you building a neighborhood redevelopment plan, providing the update after the consultation detailing how the feedback adjusted, let's say, the building heights. Some of those things are really important. So you say, here's what we heard. We did the consultation. Thank you for your feedback. Here's how we've used that to shape what the community will look like. And you'll find that the results of having these strong feedback loops is increasing trust, credibility, and really facilitating ongoing engagement or dialogue, creating a safe space for that. And remembering that it might look different in different industries. For your team, it could be staff satisfaction survey. For businesses, it could look like staff satisfaction, lower departure rates in people if they feel like they're being heard and they're being really clearly communicated with. For businesses, it could look like customer loyalty. So you could gain the trust and earn customers through practices like this. So, some of the key takeaways that I want to leave you with is values-driven communication isn't just for government, it's essential across business as well. Um, Same with public engagement. Public engagement frameworks like IAP2 can help organizations in a number of different ways. Taking some of those concepts are key. So, building trust with customers and employees, creating meaningful participation in brand storytelling, corporate social responsibility, and internal culture. And they foster stronger relationships by actively listening and responding to feedback. And in the end, businesses or organizations that engage their stakeholders transparently and inclusively see better long-term results from customer retention, like I spoke of, to employee satisfaction. And whether it's government or business, engagement and communication is most effective when it is values driven, inclusive, and responsive to the audience. So I've dropped a few resources in here to support what I talked about. And this is me. If you'd like to connect or reach out, happy. We'll open it up for questions later, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have when we get to that point. And over to Grace.
Thanks, Julie. That was awesome. So, Bojuani, Grace Indigenous Cause, Makwa Dodam, Swan Lake First Nation, and Dunjabois, Bruce Mines, and Dodanago. So, hello, everyone. My name's Grace. I'm from Swan Lake First Nation, Treaty 1 territory, which is in Manitoba on my father's side. My mom is also Indigenous. She's from Wacomico First Nation on Manitoulin Island. So, currently, I'm an artist and communications professional. I currently serve as the Indigenous Outreach and Marketing Ambassador at an Indigenous IT firm, Skyfly Solutions, where I have the honor of promoting Indigenous participation in the tech and IT sector. I'm also the communications lead for Serpent River First Nation through my own business, Anishinaabe Inc. So today I'm going to be talking about meaningful and authentic relationship building and Indigenous engagement. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about understanding the importance of involving Indigenous communities in decisions that directly affect them, reciprocal and authentic relationships rather than transactional interactions, and sharing some resources and information on how you can start and where you can begin in all of this. This could be an entire presentation itself, so I'm trying to make this as digestible with as much feedback and resources as I can. So before I begin, I would also just like to quickly note that I do not speak for all Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. Every nation has their own practices, beliefs, and traditions, and I'm speaking from my own experiences and my own traditional community. So I want to talk a little bit about engaging with Indigenous communities. And I have on the screen here, as you can see, engaging with Indigenous communities isn't just the right thing to do. It's a pathway to meaningful, mutually beneficial relationships that create lasting impact. True engagement means active collaboration, not just consultation, ensuring Indigenous voices shape the process from the start. So I want to talk a bit about why Indigenous engagement is so essential. Indigenous peoples have been here since time immemorial and are the stewards and caretakers of this land. It's essential that Indigenous peoples are engaged, listened to, and involved in every step of the process. So, why is this so important? Involvement from the start. Indigenous communities must shape decisions that impact them. Authentic relationships over transactions. So engagement should be about long-term partnerships, not just meeting a requirement or checking a box. And having that respect, those reciprocal relationships and responsibility. Engagement should be mutually beneficial. So when you're thinking about engaging with Indigenous communities, when you reach out to them, ensuring that you're not just pushing your own agenda, but what's in it for them? How are you benefiting that community? And how are you empowering that community as well? We want to think beyond transactions, right? Beyond checking that checkbox within your organization or your business and building relationships that are built on trust, respect, and that reciprocal relationship that we just spoke of. When you engage with Indigenous communities, you're also creating stronger communities and stronger economies. So meaningful partnerships drive shared prosperity, job creation, and economic resilience. You also gain insights to Indigenous knowledge, which brings sustainable solutions and fresh perspectives. So you have those cultural insights and innovations. And then also that commitment to reconciliation. Authentic engagement supports equity, inclusion, and long-term trust building. So by prioritizing meaningful engagement, we unlock opportunities for both Indigenous communities and yourself, your business, your organization, yourself, creating a foundation for lasting ethical partnerships. So I always say when we talk about engaging with Indigenous communities, this isn't just benefiting yourself or your business or organization or wherever it is that you are coming in from. It engages everyone and it helps everybody. We all benefit. So now I want to talk a little bit about where to begin because we always get asked in this space, okay, this is all great, but how do I start this? So I'm just going to share a few little tidbits of what I have here. So I always start by saying, do your homework. So what I mean by this is not in the sense where you're in school and you're doing your homework, but before working with an Indigenous community or individual, taking the time to learn about their community before reaching out to them. So this can be culturally informed and respectful. So you want to make sure that you're learning about the community's history. It could be governance, traditions, values, it could be the language that that community is speaking, could be what region it's in. Learning about all these different things is really important, and remembering that every nation is unique. So let's say, for example, you are an art curator and you're reaching out to an Indigenous artist. Taking a few minutes just to learn what community they are from and what traditional language they speak in that community can be a world of a difference in an email. Even if they aren't fluent in that language, incorporating a simple "hello, Ani" at the beginning of your email can create a more welcoming communication with that individual. Another example could be knowing when the hunting season is for the individual or the community that you're reaching out to. So let's say, for example, you're making a job posting and you're looking to post that within that Indigenous community, but it's during their hunting season, so no one's online or they're not on phones or computers for the majority of that month. Then you may want to reevaluate your communications plan in that regard. So this is why doing that research ahead of time is really, really important in building authentic relationships with Indigenous communities. And remembering that this takes time, effort, and a commitment to mutual respect. So I'm going to move down in here. So another example that I have in here is engaging with Indigenous professionals or consultants. So I always say, if you are unsure of where to begin and you don't know how to get this process started, make sure that you reach out to Indigenous businesses and peoples where it's literally their career to help you with this. So working with an Indigenous consulting firm or individual can ensure that your approach is culturally informed, respectful, and meaningful. So when in doubt, speak with Indigenous professionals who have that lived experience and knowledge to assist you in this. Prioritize relationship building. So never go to a community expecting that transactional relationship and having that set agenda or a set plan already in place without their input. Working with Indigenous peoples and communities is about that reciprocal relationship, respect, and long-term relationship building. Respect Indigenous decision-making processes. So understanding that timelines and priorities may differ from yours. So an example of that is in my community, we view time as cyclical rather than linear, meaning decisions are not always linear and they're not always within that time frame of, okay, let's work in this order or this specific, time frame of managing your time. It's going to be different, right? So for example, we work with the 13 moons of creation instead of the 12-month calendar. So that's an example of that cyclical way of thinking and thinking with the seasons instead of that linear framework. And we also have our own governance system. So in my community, it's focused on community instead of individualistic. So knowing these timeframes about a community or their governance structures or how they make decisions is really key in reaching out to them and working collaboratively with them. Seek permission and input early. So again, I said this earlier, but you never want to go to a community with a set plan or agenda already in place. You want to reach out to them from the very beginning to make sure that they're involved in every step of the way. Something that you may have heard about before is nothing about us without us. And this is really important when you're thinking about any decision or communication or collaborative effort with an Indigenous person or community. It's the idea that they should be involved in every step of the process and ensuring that you're making those culturally informed decisions with them. And last but not least, this list could go on, but trying to keep it again as short and sweet to the point as I can. Honoring those reciprocal relationships. Engagement should benefit both parties. Ask, how does this partnership uplift and empower the community instead of how does it just empower and uplift yourself? So I know that that was a lot of things to think about and to put on you, but I wanted to also share some really helpful resources to help go along with this as well as you're learning and thinking about all of this. Because again, this is a really great place to start with these. So just want to preface this by saying that I'm not affiliated or endorsed by any of the following businesses or resources. I'm simply sharing valuable resources that I recommend. So the first one is 27 tips on what to say and do in working effectively with Indigenous peoples. You can find this online. The Indigenous Ally Toolkit you can find online as well. You can find out whose land you're on and what land you occupy at native-land.ca or from the Native Land app and Whose Land apps. Another really great resource is 23 tips on what not to say or do when working effectively with Indigenous peoples. Again, you can find all of these great resources online. And some consulting and guidance from Indigenous peoples and businesses that I highly recommend would be McKenna Consulting, Three Sisters Consulting, and Envision Insight Group and Consulting Company. So again, if you're unsure of where to start and you want to reach out to Indigenous consultants to inform your work, I would highly recommend those individuals. And again, there's so many other amazing consultants and businesses out there, but these are the ones that I worked closely with lately that I would highly recommend. And last but not least, CCIB hosts webinars on partnering with Indigenous communities that you can find online as well. So again, some key takeaways. True engagement is rooted in respect, listening, and long-term relationship building. Having those reciprocal relationships, trust, and inclusion are essential, remembering nothing about us without us. And authentic partnerships go beyond consultation. They foster meaningful collaboration, and that every nation is unique. So thank you so much, Chima Gwech. If you're looking to connect, you can find me on most platforms at Grace Swain Art or graceswainart@gmail.com. And if your community needs support with communications and marketing, you're interested in any of these resources that I have listed, they're going to be sent out as well. Or you just have any questions or inquiries, or even you're interested in my work in the tech and IT sector, this is where you can reach me. Bamapi.
Unmute myself. Amazing. I'll start by saying I am not a communications specialist, so maybe that gives me an out on not being as talented and experienced as these two that you just heard from. I do have a diverse experience, however, across multiple sectors and education as well, which I think has helped me see the world in different ways. To that same point, I am not a communications expert, and unfortunately, and I'm here to share resources that gave me real aha moments around how to communicate complex issues that kind of changed how I looked at things. And obviously, you know, we've made all sorts of mistakes in communicating, and we learn from that as well. But I'm not convinced anyone hears anything I say. I have adolescent and adult children that have confirmed that, including in our organization where I'm having to communicate policies and procedures and get desperate enough to pay people with lunches to see if they've listened to me or not. So all with a grain of salt. But I want to thank Courtney for inviting us to speak because it actually reignited how I was communicating. I looked back on some of the tools that I've been using and have used, and I just want to thank you for that, Courtney, because bit of a gift to me to remind me of what is available. So my topic of presentation is going to be talking about values and communicating social issues. Know your values and frame the debate. One of the key influencers in some of the work that I've done is George Lakoff. The role of framing metaphors and storytelling, which is really reinforced by other resources that I've used, such as the Framework Institute, and then some other examples from the field itself. So for me, something that shaped me before I originally entered into any of my professional social work practice, I had an experience where my family was giving away something we had extra of. I think it was rose plants or rose bush. And I recall listening to the neighbor through the fence, and they were apprehensive about receiving these gifts. What did we really want? Why would we give her these for free? This overheard conversation got me thinking and asking more questions of myself. What experiences did this person have that would make her wary of receiving a gift? Had her experiences growing up changed how she viewed and interacted with other people? How was I so lucky that I happened to grow up in the stable, loving home that I was in? What did I do to be so lucky when maybe others weren't? Not knowing it at the time, these questions had me exploring the ideas of individualism versus collectivism, amongst other things. Beyond this, further along in my professional career, I found challenges in practicing municipal social work in a small town, Alberta, particularly as a public servant. I had social work values that I was adhering to that were bumping up against the values and expectations of being a public servant. So let me tell you how dirty the word advocacy is when you're in government. I think some of that's going by the wayside, but it is a word that you're not supposed to use that is really central to social work practice. Also, I come from a large family, all working in industry, which was a challenge for me to maybe be heard when I'm kind of seen as through this lens of the bleeding heart, a social worker, that kind of thing. So I felt even to some degree silenced in my own family. We've learned how to be empathetic about how people with different experiences view and interact with the world. Some for me are from my own personal experiences with adversity, some with aha learning moments that actually shifted how I saw the world. It was like things just opened up, some type of cognitive dissonance that allowed me to see things in a different way, especially from how I would have thought things were to be true. And I started to ask more questions. What do others hear differently from me? How is others' culture, values, and understanding different than mine? How did my lens or personal values and implicit biases limit me from truly understanding and connecting with others that I'm working to serve and advocate with and for and co-create things? Was the way I was communicating having the intended impact that I was trying to have? One of my professors early on in my social work master's program, he was a specialist in environment, told us that they were going to teach us a few different languages during the course: liberal, NDP, green, conservative, and wild rose. And this got me thinking of language as a much different tool to use. Later on, as a response to communicating social issues for several years in a Alberta rural setting, learning new languages was a big reason I went back to get my MBA. Being able to communicate the same issues in maybe a different language to expand how I can be heard. So one such aha for me came from learning about the research of George Lakoff. He's often referred to as the father of framing. So Professor George Lakoff is a renowned cognitive linguist whose work has contributed to a new understanding of the ways that conceptual frames and metaphors shape our social and political lives. He is an amazing resource, multiple books, podcasts, highly recommend. So what is in a word? Neural framing. What are frames? Frames are mental structures embedded in our neural circuits, linked to morals, values, and evoked by language. They shape our goals, actions, and perceptions of outcomes. Frames exist largely below conscious awareness and define how we understand the world. So some examples you see on the screen, what do they conjure when you read them? Even tax relief. throwing relief, it's inferring that there's something already wrong with it. And I know that's a loaded thing, but there's different ways to tell that story about an investment in people. That is what taxes do. So there's different ways of framing it. Illegal aliens, this is a very hot topic right now with what's going on in politics, and you can already feel what that term, how it comes up. Health reform, add reform in front of anything, and it implies it's broken and already broken and needs to be fixed. Welfare reform, tax reform, you name it. Toxic stress, there's good ways to frame things too, is helping people understand that not all stress is equal. Some could be more harmful, some is actually helpful. Family values, that's another big one. From the field, 15 years ago when I held a inclusion and equity portfolio, when I met with elected officials and I used the words DEI, diversity, equality, equity, inclusion, what they heard was staff quotas, meritocracy, Trudeau immediately came up, and the old phrase of affirmative action from the 80s. So I had to find different ways to communicate these topics. Some of the key principles of framing is language and frames. So words activate frames in our brain, and framing is more about ideas, not just language. Consistency, so if you're looking at creating messaging and change, long-term consistent framing is necessary for acceptance. This is where culture and the current dominant discourse becomes a major influence on what is said in messaging and what is heard, and I'll share another example of that. Facts and morals. Facts must be framed in terms of their moral importance to be meaningful. You got to hit them where the values are. You've got to frame things in this way so that it becomes meaningful to those that are hearing it. There are limitations to these frames, which is where we get into metaphors and storytelling. For example, complex ideas. So new complex ideas may lack frames, making them hard to grasp. Because frames result from ideas that have been ingrained in us, new complex ideas may not have them, making them hard to act on. Lakoff provides the example, and we've probably all experienced this, of systemic causation. So it's easy to see direct causation, but the same is not true of systemic causation, which can't be experienced directly. So think about when we've had to explain the impacts of colonization, of drug addiction, of racism, and more systemic pieces and influence there. It's harder. So this is where metaphors and storytelling can help create better understanding around that. So how do we reframe social or complex issues? So Frameworks Institute, I've already mentioned, big fan of theirs. They partner with advocates, researchers, storytellers, and coalitions to reframe different issues, hot topic issues. They've done a ton of rigorous research on culture, cognition, communications, and they've done research on frames that audiences already hold in these areas. So for any of you folks that are in the audience, they're a great tool to go to. So one of the things on the screen is an example of where we would present research, but it does not serve the intended purpose due to existing frames. The example here is from early childhood development and the importance of the early years, and it was an example presented by Nat Kendall-Taylor, who works for the Frameworks Institute. So we know that persistent stress can derail child development, cause long-term negative impacts on health and well-being. This is amazing. This was done, I think, 10 or 15 years ago, probably closer to 15 years ago. This research, we know it even more so to be true. And so excited, let's share it. Let's talk about what's heard. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Life is hard. It's supposed to be. There's many success stories of people who've made it that come from very adverse childhood experiences. So this is from this. Many years of research. This one was used by the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard and used actually an Alberta Family Wellness Initiative that my own community used and utilized to develop campaigns to take the complex understanding of early childhood development and break it down into a more simplified story. I'll share a little bit about that in a bit. The mistake we often make is assuming that our audience are empty vessels or slates, just waiting to be filled and inspired by the data, research, and info we give them. The reality is that culture, values, norms adjusts how they hear and how they hear what we're sharing with them. And that's the disconnect. And it was a big aha learning for me. So the power of metaphors, similes, analogies, and comparisons, super powerful tools. They introduce unfamiliar issues, explain complex concepts, and shift mindsets by sparking new associations and understandings. The benefits of metaphors are they provide new mental frameworks, opening up dead-end conversations and avoiding repetitive debate. They help advance ideas and shape conversations on social issues and beyond. So some of the key principles are to rely on research. So metaphors can affect understanding in unexpected ways. So it's helpful to use tested metaphors to ensure they represent concepts accurately. Introduce the concepts early and explicitly to help guide responses. So we avoid distracting metaphors and overwhelming research that can cause people to tune out. Extend them over time and context. So consistently using metaphors across different contexts and networks helps new ways of thinking take root and engages others in sharing these ideas. An example of effective metaphor use is the brain architecture metaphor that was used by the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. It's been used in various formats, helping shift public thinking and policy on early childhood development. Now, this is where I'm going to attempt to share my screen on that video. I won't have to play it long. It's just going to give you kind of the an understanding of what that metaphor now looks like. There we go. Share sound. Look at me. I might be professional. Can you guys see that? Really? Boom.
We have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious, ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's.
So back to this, can you folks hear me still? Too many screens open now.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Did you hear the video?
Yep.
I couldn't hear it on my end, so I just was guessing. You know, that video was an example how frameworks took the research they conducted on frames and took the complex idea of early childhood development, and you saw things like brain architecture, air traffic control, the serve and return between parents. It became more digestible, taking complex issues and even beyond this, there's other ones that talk more about how you can build a healthy community that supports the child. So it talks about more of those systemic issues that can influence the early child years. So you can see examples of how storytelling and metaphors were used. Some notes from the field. In some of the work I'm involved in now in industry with some of the ground search for residential schools. In communities, many of the survivors are now using terms like the telling of truths versus the sharing of their stories. That was a very powerful shift in language that I've seen. In industry, we're seeing a big shift from impact benefit agreements, or early exploration agreements, to impact benefit, engagement agreements, participation agreements, collaboration agreements. They're all meant to spark different frames. We were in a classroom up north telling a little bit about our geophysics technology, and our staff member used the metaphor of guitar strings vibrating to help simplify the science behind our surveys. Ground penetrating radar specifically, we use the analogy or metaphor of a fish finder to help break down more complex topics into something that now makes sense. So key takeaways: audiences are not empty vessels waiting for us to fill them with our info. Culture, values, norms, and experience shape how they hear and are impacted by what we want to communicate. Frames are mental structures embedded in our neural circuitry that shape our perception, goals, actions, values, and moral sense, largely operating below conscious awareness and activated by language, which carries and evokes the underlying ideas. Metaphors are not just literary devices, but they're tools for thinking. They can reshape our shared mental images of social issues and other issues and amplify our impact when used wisely. Storytelling helps to create an understanding of complex topics that involve multiple systems and variables. Resources, I've listed several: Frameworks Institute, everything George Lakoff. The Commons Social Change Library was another one that I didn't mention in the presentation, but is obviously another really great resource. And you can connect with me as well. So some of the wrap up and Q&A, I'm assuming I got my mic on, I might as well do this. Everyone's not sick of hearing me yet. Wrap up, there's a universal importance of values in shaping authentic, effective communication. Values are shaped by cultural norms, societal expectation, and lived experience. Tying it all together, know your audience and educate yourself. That means knowledge, respect, and being relational. What we want to communicate may be heard in a different way depending on the audience. Consider these lenses. And these values intersect across different sectors and audiences. So application of these concepts, whether in a business, community, or speaking with the public, all these tools can be used. Feedback loops, neural frames, being authentic and reciprocal in your communication. Do you have challenges and lessons learned in engaging diverse audiences? And now the floor is open. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. All right. Yeah, we'll open it to questions. Feel free to just turn on your mic or put it in the chat. I'll be monitoring both.
I just read your message, Courtney. I was like,
oh, no worries.
We've lulled everyone.
No. People will speak up. I know it happens every time. I can start off. I had one question. It's maybe not to do with anything specific, but I'm wondering if you guys have any insights. One thing I've heard about is that with framing, sometimes it can feel like manipulation to some people. Do you have any thoughts on me saying that?
Yep. No, absolutely. Actually, when I was taught these resources, that's exactly where I went. I was like, so yes, you're right. Frames can be used to manipulate, to spin situations, and to create negative and it happens all the time. It's like, look at every political message that comes out, look at commercials. And so it's having that awareness. I think the idea is that it can be used to promote different understanding and also be used for good. But yes, you're absolutely right. That's what I said. I'm like, this sounds like marketing around that. So I know frameworks and George Lakoff is very entrenched in understanding the language and linguistics that is political, which is often tied to other things. But it's fascinating the work that Frameworks has done around helping, in their mind, talk the good or doing good with these situations. So, but that's all subjective.
Yeah, no, that makes sense though. Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Hi, first I want to thank all three of you for providing some excellent presentations, giving me a few aha moments as I was listening to you, and I can't wait to look at the presentations again. One question that I have, I hope I'm not going too off topic of communication. It is communication, but it's for Melissa. So it has to do with framing again. And I'm a student outreach coordinator, and I try to promote careers in the mining industry. And one of the biggest struggles that I face is the word mining. And I think that, has a very negative image in itself. And I've been trying to change that word. And so I'm curious to see how that word in particular how you've been working around it in your promotion within your company.
Yeah, and it's an interesting topic, even in some of the Indigenous communities where there's a lot of development going on as well. So, and it's a hard one. Like I said, it took nearly 5 years for me to even move over to industry, which I've got no problem with. My whole family's in it, but I need to always be connected to what it brings. And so, on the mining side, I've shared like educational material around, hey, what's in your iPad? How many different materials exist in your iPad, in your phone? How do you get through your daily life? And then looking at the opportunities that are there, because God knows there's enough negative stories. But the natural resource sector provides a lot of amazing opportunities for everyone, for communities. And really it's that connection to the land. So that's the other thing, is what binds us as opposed to what bumps up against. So it's that relationship with the land. And so those that are involved in exploration, it's feeding their families, it's providing opportunity, and it's a different relationship than the beautiful relationship Indigenous communities may have, but it is relationship, and what the land provides for you. So I've tried to focus a little bit on those commonalities. There's a really great resource out of Grand Treaty 3. They've done some amazing work between proponents and the community in indigenizing the topics. And they actually did a beautiful guide on sort of the genesis and what atomic energy, where that comes from, because there's a lot of misinformation. We know we're working in a bit of a uranium. So that's a key. That was a really key guide. If you Google it, you should be able to find it. It's a really cool, and it talks about sort of an indigenized view of where atomic and energy has come from the earth as a gift. Fascinating, just a completely different way of looking at it. So yeah.
Great.
So
thank you. That's helpful. Thank you. I will Google. Was it Grand
Treaty 3? I'll shoot it off to Courtney and she can share with the group.
Great. Thank you.
But that whole region, they've got beautiful toolkits that were developed by Indigenous folks for proponents to go, here, this is how you communicate with us. This is what's important to us.
Thank you.
I have a question in the chat from Hillary. So it says, how is timing important for communication, especially with how fast things are changing? Are you trying to get ahead or be responsive to misinformation or sit back and don't take the bait? How do you pick the right moment to communicate?
Mhm.
I think it depends what the topic is that you want to communicate. I always say proactive communication is going to go a lot further than reactive communications. Um, and if you're being reactive, then you're responding to usually like a very vocal minority rather than coming out and being really deliberate in what you're putting out as communication. So I would say that from a municipal government perspective, just as a note, whenever we'd get posts or whether they be negative comments on social media, if there was a question attached to it, we would respond. So if there was somebody asking an actual question, we would take the time to respond to them. Whereas if they were just venting, we would just let it be unless there was, specifically an action for us to take around it. But even better would be coming out with any information that people could, about something people would hear or see or would interrupt their daily life. We would always come out with a proactive message in advance to try to address that, so that it didn't turn into a big issue or create that negative response from people. Does that answer your question?
Grace, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I love what you said, Julie, because I was going to say kind of the similar idea of, having that proactive instead of that reactive response. But I was going to say too, and when I'm working with communities, even in our communications plan, I usually have in there an entire section just alone on how to respond to comments. So you have that plan in place ahead of time so that when they do come up and you do have someone, exactly as Julie's saying, is it a question? Are we going to respond to it? How do we handle if negative comments are coming in consistently from the same person? What protocols do you have in place to prevent that and to respond to that as well? So having those in place ahead of time, I think will help. And I was going to say too, in terms of timely communication, it really depends what industry you're in. So for example, I'm in the tech industry and IT for my job, but I'm also in the Indigenous world. So for me in my role, it's really important that I'm informed about Indigenous communications, especially within not only a political lens, but community lens as well, seeing what's happening in Indigenous communities, staying up to date with the news, so that if something does happen that's directly affecting Indigenous communities and it's really pertinent to IT or even to Indigenous peoples, I can respond to it online and kind of make an educational post about it if it's relevant, or even ways of sharing it with the community and seeing, hey, this is interesting. Maybe you'd like to read about this in a positive way. So it really depends what type of information it is, right? And what you need to be informed about and share.
Yeah,
It's
and I
great.
love what you said, Grace, because having a really good communication strategy or marketing strategy in advance helps you not only prepare for some of those questions or potential risks in what you're saying, but it can also help you plan out the best timing. So ensuring that it's not conflicting with something else that's going on, that might be impacting people's ability to hear what's being said, but then it also helps you create a little bit of a maybe a SWOT analysis about what some of those potential issues might be so that you can be prepared. And then it takes a little bit of that pressure off on what's being said and when it's being said and how it's being said. So I love that, Grace. That's a good point.
Yeah, and to build on that, that's one of the benefits of frames and metaphors. So if you go onto any of those resources, you'll see examples where people have diffused a conversation that seems quite positioned online, by finding more common frames that change the conversation. So that's also a possibility. The other thing and this is just a pretty unique resource, but on Coursera, and there may be others out there now, I'm like, the stuff isn't new, but you can actually take a futures thinking course. And it provides you some really cool tips and tools because there are signals out there that are available, especially now that, social media and the internet. There are ways to look for signals around events and changes and shifts that are occurring in industry, in the public discourse. And it's sometimes as simple as like creating a search engine that lets you know of those signals. It's fascinating. And there's a futurism course, and it's on Coursera, and it's next to nothing, but it's really fascinating for looking for those signals in a different way where you could be proactive as well.
Cool. All right, we've got another question in the chat. Also, if anyone needs to pop out, I realize we're after 12 o'clock my time, so feel free to. How do you test a message, for example, a metaphor, beforehand? Do you work with a consultant or is it done internally? Also, how do you learn if the message is perceived differently? Do you actively seek feedback from the audience, for example, in child development?
Yeah, I think you can. So that's where Frameworks has kind of positioned themselves as a consultant around this. So luckily, they've got a pretty diverse cross sector of topics that they've already done some of this research on. For example, we've got some business in the ag industry, and you can actually go in and see in their toolkit research and frames they've already done. If you don't have those done, you can connect with them around it. And both the resources I shared have educational tools on how to do these things. So absolutely you can. I mean, it wasn't hard for me to test the elected officials when I showed up, and the same questions keep coming up no matter what I said. And I'm like, I'm not talking about quotas, people, but that's what they heard. So it was almost my own test, and then I had to shift. So you can find that in surveys. I was doing some inclusion and equity training or bringing it into our organization. I did a survey first of the whole organization. This was a municipality we worked for. And what I learned was they were really well educated on the history of Canada around racism across cultures. But what was a common theme is talking about equity and inclusion brought about, well, I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist. I don't have stereotypes. And I was like, okay, so this is the response to bringing this in. How do I shift it? And then the conversation came more about implicit biases. And so that was the type of resources we brought in for training, which shifted how people were thinking. We said it's normal to think in boxes because our brain works that way. Being aware of it when you're developing policies and programs and how you combat those implicit biases is part of what Julie and Grace are talking about, engaging with people, learning how to engage. So you're not letting your own implicit biases blind you when you're developing programs around being accessible and whatnot. So hopefully that helps.
All right, do we have any other questions? She said, yes, it helps. Thank you. All right, well, seeing that we are 5 past noon, I will put a pause to it. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to all the presenters. It was really fascinating hearing your guys' different perspectives, and I think there's something for everyone in this. We'll be able to apply it to our own individual practice. So yeah, thank you guys so much. And if anyone has any other questions, you've got their contact information and all the resources. So yeah, all right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you, Courtney. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.